to what extent do you think to what extent do we think you're speaking to the choir? We're the ones that are all believing in the value of the individual spirit, soul, student. But anyway, um, I'll shut up and begin. Hi there, I'm Carolivia Herron. I teach classics at Howard University. I'm in the English department now because Howard University got rid of its classics department, but I'm still teaching the same things I was teaching before. They're called by different names. They're given English department names, but I'm still teaching um, primarily classical epic as it applies to contemporary world and contemporary life. And my concept of classics has indeed expanded from what was traditional to the classics of Asia and Africa and even of Latin America. So I do teach African epics, Gilgamesh, and epics of India, Mahabharata, and so forth. My field is epic poetry, uh, and so I think I got a PhD in black and dead white men. Um, and but I've been trying to extend it more. Okay, um, dear Anika, I'm sorry. I thought I was supposed to start a, in a few minutes. So I'm not sure how much time I have. Can you? I want to look at my clock. Can you just give me an idea of how much time? Anika, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. I was trying to find my button. You have until like 4:35.
Okay, so I'll leave time for talk for
Okay.
conversation after. Okay, well, I'm going to do something a little bit different from what I uh, expected to do. I thought I was going to give you a fully um, scholarly talk, but I thought instead I'll take you on the journey of a novelist. In addition to being a professor, I've written two novels. One is a humongous and could qualify as four, and I have several children's books out. And my I I have just recently completed a play based on given the name of Pharsalia, which of course comes from Lucan of first century CE, about the Roman Civil War. And I thought I would take you on the journey, the creative writing journey that took me to Lucan. Actually, it was Dante, Lucan, and Pharsalia, and how it changed my own life. Just a way of showing the way in which this classic a classic search has really moved my own life. I was first I read Milton's Paradise Lost prior to starting college at Howard University back in 1965, and I thought that was the greatest work in the history of the world, and couldn't imagine anything better than Paradise Lost. And then I got to Howard University and I read Dante's Inferno in translation in English, and also read some essays saying that Dante was the greatest poet in the history of the world, that sort of thing. And I was rather stunned by these articles. But to me, if you compare Dante versus Milton, Milton is so much better than Dante that I didn't even think there was any argument about it. And clearly, I was attracted to the epic impulse from the very beginning of loving writing. And I remember arguing with teachers and students at Howard in the 60s, back then when Stokely Carmichael was around and all that, saying that I couldn't understand anybody preferring Dante to Milton. And I left Howard after 2 years and transferred to Eastern Baptist College in Pennsylvania. And while I was there, I took my first trip to Europe. And I went to Firenze, Florence. And while I was there, uh, I bought my first Italian edition of the Divine Comedy. It was, and I remember sort of sitting on a bench somewhere in Florence, in Italy, and reading the opening lines in Italian, which I didn't really know. And I don't know how it was, and I hope all of us have had that experience, even if you don't fully know a language and you're just at the beginning of it, you begin to see that something is conveyed in another language that's not conveyed in your first language, which of course for me is English. And I started reading Dante, and I thought, oh my goodness. And for the first time, I felt like I understood why people could say that Dante was greater than or equivalent to, and I agree with, I forget, was it Vicky or somebody here who spoke earlier saying, you don't need to decide who's better. But I began to see the beauty and the power and the greatness of Dante's work and kept my mouth shut more when people were talking about the the beauty of of the Divine Comedy. So I bought my first copy of the Divine Comedy in Italian, and it was about 10 years later, and on another visit to Europe, when I wrote my first novel, thereafter Johnny, and when I was in the process, I wrote most of it while I was in Portugal, Almancil, Portugal. But I traveled through England and through Europe prior to going to a villa Portugal where I wrote most of this novel. And it's very strange, but today being the funeral of the Pope, I was actually in Vatican City on Christmas Day. Uh, in the 1974 or something, when I sat there about reading Dante's work and feeling so steeped in it, and I felt that in the process of reading it, I felt like my brain started opening up to something brand new, and I went from there to Almancil, Portugal, where I wrote, uh, where I made a great big chart of images and thoughts that had come to me from various books that I love. They included European classics as well as African American classics, uh, Invisible Man and so forth. But I became intrigued by the canto in which the poets walk together in limbo, and so much so I'm going to skip a few years from there. Uh, I took a few years out when I wasn't teaching in a university. I was teaching kids, 3 to 7 year olds, at Children's Studio School here in Washington D.C. And the name of each studio had its own name, and the name of my studio was Path Studio. And in Path Studio, I had a little. I put some sandbags and like a hill where students could walk up and think. And the idea was it would be similar to the point in Limbo when Virgil and Dante meet Homer and Horace and Lucan and Ovid, and it's a magic. I hope all I'm sure all of you have read it. It's just a magical place, and Dante speaks of it as a place filled with light in the midst of that gloomy darkness of limbo, and that there he was welcomed to. He was welcomed. Dante, as a character, was welcomed with Virgil, Homer, Horace, Ovid, and Lucan into this special place where there are things that can be spoken there that can be spoken nowhere else. So I later on again, and when I was teaching in this studio school, children's studio school in Washington D.C., I know help each other, and you know,
Your connection is a little off, I think. Is everybody else connection okay for Carolivia?
It's going in and
I'm
out
so
a little
sorry.
bit.
I don't know.
Okay, it's going in and out a little bit.
Oh, I'm sorry. Was that
That's okay. It wasn't. It just started. It just started
okay?
doing that. It just started. Just when now you're fine, I think.
Okay. Well, maybe I'll get. Okay, I'm going to be closer to the microphone. and maybe I won't wave my hands around so much. Okay, so one of the things I did as I applied this idea of the great poets who meet in limbo in Dante. I made a place in my classroom for these 5 year olds to talk to each other in privacy, quietly, in a space where there are things that are appropriate to be spoken there, but are not appropriate to be spoken elsewhere. And that's a translation of the Italian, as I'm sure you remember, all of you. And then again, going back, I just that's an aside. I want to go back to the to developing. I finished the novel. I came back to the United States. I got a PhD, and I went and became a professor, and all these kinds of things. And I slowly started learning more about the poets that Dante places in limbo. I took graduate courses in Ovid. I read Horace's lyric poetry, especially the Ars Poetica, the art of the poet, and what you don't do and what you do. And of course, Homer was a superstar for me, and Virgil another. And I read all of them, but never could figure out. I have these little cards that I'm using. I, that I use for ideas that I got from each one. Virgil, how can such anger linger among the gods or the goddesses? And Dante, midway through the journey of our life, I came to myself in the midst of a dark wood. And Homer, anger, sing anger, O goddess. And for Horace, I remember writing my own version of Ars Poetica, which I've totally forgotten and lost. But the note I wrote for today, I was reminded of a tune that I looked it up on the internet, and many people have sung the tune. Evidently, it came out in 1929. I discovered, but I remember the Sesame Street puppets doing it. Mama don't allow no guitar playing around here. You know, that kind of thing. It's like Horace don't allow this and Horace don't allow that and Horace don't allow other. But coming up with the idea that in spite of the world that Horace created for what can and cannot be done in art and poetry and literature, that it changes and that I could change it, and having a sort of fellowship with Horace. And then Ovid, I loved totally because of the metamorphoses and all the epics that. And I going back to was it Sheena or Vicky? I'm sorry, I'm forgetting who said this about the rape of the sobbing woman. That was Vicky, right? The I can remember expecting the gods to punish all the rapists, and the gods didn't when I first read those stories, and I was so shocked by that. But finally, I said to myself, well, "Who is this other dude? Who is this guy named Lucan?" I'd never, my field is my PhD is in comparative literature rather than in classics directly. So, by able to pick and choose what works I read, primarily epics, I actually didn't get much of Lucan, even though Pharsalia is a late Roman epic. Um, so I started studying Lucan and reading the text, and uh, I be, it became, it's actually become one of the more important changes in my life, my creative life, and in so many ways, because uh, Lucan himself was born after the birth of Jesus, and he died before the fall of Jerusalem. And I'm Jewish, and so it was really intriguing to me to get a glimpse of how the world was perceived in that period when time changed, the Common Era, before the Common Era to the Common Era, and the life of the Jewish people was utterly changed by the fall of Jerusalem in 70 CE. And I I started reading him more carefully and discovered that he was in one part of Pharsalia. Lucan suggests that Rome would have done better for itself if it had just gone around and beaten up all these other countries instead of fighting itself. He was complaining that instead of civil war, it should have been conquering other lands and other nations. And even though didn't say so in the text itself, the implication is that one of those nations that should have conquered and beat up is Israel. And that I realized he wrote this before the fall of Jerusalem, and so that became more and more a part of my mind, and I started searching uh, in in my own, quite frankly, in my own oral tradition, because I kept feeling that there was an echo of something here that I didn't quite understand, and I started tracing the word Massalia through all the through my memory and through all the text I could find, and lo and behold, what do I find is that Farsalia, among other things, is the name given to the plantation in Nelson County, Virginia, where some of my ancestors were enslaved. So then I wanted to know why, because the Farsalia plantation in Virginia was founded about 1814, well before the Civil War, of course, and it was celebrating. It was naming itself after a place where a civil war took place. So why? And certainly it was a place that enslaved so many people. And I discovered that the place where most of my well, the most horrendous, I should say, story has come from the Devil's Half Acre, which is a slave jail that was in Richmond, Virginia, where my great grandmother Mary Ann Lumpkin was enslaved and had her babies and people that I'm descended from and so forth. And and in my research, I discovered that slave owners who couldn't make their slaves behave like slaves, that wouldn't whose spirits would not be broken, were sent to the Devil's Half Acre as a last resort. But that in a few cases, these slaves were sent to Pharsalia first, give so almost like the second to the last chance. And if they still didn't act right, then they were sent on to to they were sent from Pharsalia to the Devil's Half Acre. And I did some more research, and here I have to thank my colleague Dr. Judith Pillar Hallett. Done some research on Cato and plays that were written by Addison and were prominent in the United States colonies during the 18th century. That Pharsalia, of course, was not complaining. Pharsalia, as used in the United States, was a way of saying the Roman Republic is a good idea. That is, the United States Republic is a good idea, and it was not, of course, at all concerned about slaves not having freedom and those sorts of things. And so it seemed very ironic to me that the one member of Dante's Inferno that I had no clue about, and that he seemed like I felt like Dante had just stuck him in there, and had no good reason to place him to place him in with these other great poets, ended up being for me uh, like a string, like a string I was using in a labyrinth, following along a string that led me to the story of my own family. And since I started that uh, search, and then after I pieced something together, went back to relatives in my family. Some of my family moved to Boston, and talked to them, and then the name I realized why the name Farsalia became so important to me, because it was an oral tradition name about my own life and about my own heritage. And then it was in 2022 that I was commissioned by Theater J here in Washington D.C. to write a play to try to expand what's called extending the canon. And I last year I was at Anika's program like this. Last year I talked about the actual work. But this year, I want to talk about the path getting there through reading the classics, and how it actually forms a framework for creative writing that I've used for myself, and frankly, I've been using in the classroom, taking some of the fictional framework of stories such as this, and creating multimedia representations of them with all kinds of blanks in them, and asking students. Essentially, I created 9 chambers, fictional chambers from ancient Egypt and ancient Rome and ancient Greece and everything, and with a little bit of description for each one. And I asked the students to choose one that seems appropriate for them, and people it with some concept of their own lives as they interconnect with this ancient text, or perception, or visual, or something like that. Anyway, so I've tried to share with you how it is that my own creative world has expanded through this path of going through a classical reading to complete this play that was. We had the workshop at Theater J in February, and we hope to have a production within the next year. Uh, uh, and that's number one. And number two, it's led me to develop a different way of teaching humanities. I teach primarily humanities at Howard University, and uh, essentially, I create multimedia, very modernistic kinds of what should I say, digitalized worlds, almost as if I were doing a PlayStation or Game Boy or something. But in those worlds that I create in a digital world, I place ancient texts, uh, yeah, Homer and Dante, and um, the African epic that I use primarily is a pearl epic called Hambo Deggio. I use that one, which is not very well known, because I helped to translate it. It hadn't been translated before, and I don't know the Pearl language very well. But I had a student from there, so we worked together, and I used the French version, and worked with her and was able to do a translation of it, so that we could use it in one of our scenes, as it were. And so I have, as a product of all of this, essentially an elaborate multimedia universe created by 35 or 40 students, who are responding to ancient texts, with their own choice. Why I chose this text over that one, and what is it for, and what does it mean, and how it intersects with my own experience. And I really feel in agreement with the people I've heard so far. I think I've only heard about 3 of others of you, about we're here not to get a job. I hope they do get a job. I don't want them to starve, but that's not what I'm here for. And I'm not trying to turn everybody into a classicist, but rather that as you go off to be whatever it is you are, that you'll carry this sense of yourself with you. And I entitle the course. I give all of my humanities courses a subtitle: "Your Story and Our Song of Songs." So I include the story of the student. I figure we're teaching humanities, and we're all human in this room. So why don't we start with us and let's figure out our stories, and how does it intersect with the ancient story? In a way, I think I'm doing it backwards, from what Michael has suggested. I don't start by saying what is the culture we're already in. I basically start by saying, who are you? And here's what I think. I think what you just said reminds me of something I read about fourth century BCE, and here it is. Look, and that sort of thing. So anyway, yeah, I think I've gone through all my cards here. I should say that one of the things that I prize in the play that I finished, the title is Pharsalia, or For Crying Out Loud. and it brings together the stories of three of my ancestors. One, a Wampanoag man who was whose father had escaped from slavery and run away to Massachusetts, and he got married there and had a son who was captured and brought into slavery. He had been born free, but brought back into slavery. I shouldn't say brought back because he wasn't a slave to start with, but through a misuse of the fugitive slave law, he was brought into slavery and essentially died in slavery near Pharsalia Plantation. That's one of the characters. And my Jewish ancestor, Sarah Bat Asher, who is a black Jewish woman carrying with her the memory of actually Lucan's Pharsalia and the fall of Jerusalem, which is carried through centuries. The play takes place in 1852, by the way. And then thirdly, Marianne Lumpkin, the African American who was enslaved at Devil's Half Acre. So that's really what I have. I just wanted to share that journey with you, and would love questions, or comments, thoughts, anything. Yeah. Thank you, Rebecca. I hope I get to share it soon.